It was a bitterly cold January morning in northern Minnesota when four old friends gathered at the base of a snow covered mountain. They had been planning this hiking trip for months, and they were all very excited to finally begin their adventure. The four guys, Jake, Mike, Tom, and Dan, had grown up together and had remained close despite now living in different parts of the country. As they strapped on their snowshoes and adjusted their backpacks, they couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation mixed with a bit of nervousness. None of them had ever hiked in the winter before, and they knew that the journey ahead would be a challenging one. Jake, the group's self-appointed leader, consulted his GPS and pointed to the trailhead. "All right, guys, let's do this. We have a long way to go today, but we can make it if we stick together." The four friends set off on the trail, crunching through the snow with each step. The forest was quiet, with only the sound of their footsteps and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird to break the silence. Squirrel! The snow-covered trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows on the trail. Despite the cold, the group was in high spirits. They laughed and joked with each other, telling stories of their past adventures and reminiscent about old times. They were grateful for this chance to reconnect and experience something new together. As they climbed higher and higher up the mountain, the snow began to fall more heavily, swirling around them in a flurry of white. But the four friends were undeterred. They had come too far to turn back now. They pushed on through the snow, determined to reach the summit and to make this trip a memory they would never forget. That's going to be an understatement. As they hiked further up the mountain, the snow became deeper and the terrain became more challenging. Suddenly, their GPS started malfunctioning. Goddamn made in China shit. They continued on, but before they knew it, they realized they were lost. Panic set in, and they all looked around, trying to find a familiar landmark. They tried calling for help, but their phones had no signal. As the sun began to set, they knew they would have to spend the night in the frosty forest. The four friends quickly built a shelter using branches and leaves, started a campfire, and huddled together for warmth. They tried to keep their spirits up, but the cold and fear of the unknown made it very difficult. As night fell, they heard the sound of wolves howling in the distance, and the eerie sound sent shivers down their spines. They huddled closer together, sharing stories to distract themselves from the ominous sounds of the wilderness around them. After a couple of hours, as the snow continued to fall, Dan, the most overweight of the group, complained of being hungry. Shocker. Jake handed him a granola bar. Dan wolfed it down, hardly chewing it, and demanded another. Jake told him they needed to ration their remaining food in case they were stuck in the woods for a long time. Dan protested and said he needed more food than everyone else because of his size. The two old friends got up in each other's faces and argued for several minutes. A shoving contest ensued. "Hit him!" Mike and Tom had to restrain them to avoid an altercation. "Hell no! Let him fight. I've got $20 on Jake." After half an hour had passed, Dan had calmed down. Dan got up to go take a piss. Jake said, "Don't go too far. We don't want to have to go looking for you." Dan replied, "Fuck off." As the three sat around the campfire, talking about their next move, they heard Dan shout from the woods, "Holy shit!" Startled, the group jumped to their feet in concert. Jake, a former Boy Scout, pulled out his flashlight and quickly scoured the woodline around them. Jake yelled, "Dan, where the hell are you?" He got no response. Jake started walking toward the area where Dan's voice came from. The other two friends followed closely behind, shouting their friend's name into the darkness. "Scooby-Doo, where are you?" As they moved deeper into the woods, they could hear twigs snapping and leaves rustling in the distance. They stopped and listened closely. Thinking it was probably a bear or a mountain lion, Mike pulled out his revolver. Now we're talking. Suddenly, they heard their friend scream again, this time closer than before. "Guys, they're over here! Hurry up!" They ran towards the sound of Dan's voice, their hearts racing with fear and adrenaline as they plodded through the knee-deep snow. As they rounded a bend in the trail, they saw their friend lying on the ground. His body bloodied and mangled. He was missing a leg and part of his arm. His stomach was ripped open and his guts were strewn out on the bloody snow. The smell of death was everywhere. I kind of leaned towards the dark side on this story. They rushed to his aid. Tom was an EMT and frantically fumbled for his first aid kit. However, Dan was horribly disemboweled. Tom could easily tell no first aid kit was going to fix him. Yeah, I think he's past the point of needing some Neosporin and a Band-Aid. Then, not too far into the woods, they heard a strange scream, then the crunch of snow. Mike's father was a park ranger, and Mike was familiar with all the sounds of the wildlife in the area. However, Mike didn't recognize this call of the wild at all. Assuming it was some kind of a bear, Jake pulled his bear spray out of its holster and armed it. Jake, with a flashlight in one hand and bear spray in the other, led the group toward the scream. I'd let the dude with the gun lead, personally. The others followed closely behind. They saw a smaller tree shaking in front of them, with snow raining down all around it. As they got closer, they could hear a grunting noise. They froze in place. Figuring it was a bear, Mike fired off a round into the air to scare it off. As they continued focusing on the tree, it stopped moving. They could hear something running away through the snow. Assuming the gunshot worked, they turned around and walked back towards Dan's body to bring it back to their campsite. But when they got there, Dan's body was gone. Only a steaming puddle of blood that had melted through the snow remained. They frantically hurried back to the campsite in a panic. They all three tried to use their phones, but again, no one had any service. Man, I hate Sprint. An hour passed. The snow stopped coming down. Their firewood was dwindling down quickly. They were going to need more to stay warm and survive. Jake and Mike decided to fetch some more wood, while Tom stayed at the campsite beside the fire. Finding downed trees in the deep snow wasn't easy, but Jake and Mike found some and started dragging them back to camp. They saw the firelight flickering in the trees above and used that to guide themselves back. When they were almost there, Jake saw Tom sitting by the fire and a large shadow creeping up behind him. Jake dropped the logs and yelled, "Tom, behind you!" Tom turned around and screamed in horror. "Ah!" The giant monster swiped at Tom with its long claws. Tom collapsed to the ground. Jake and Mike, in a full sprint, ran back to the camp. When they arrived, they found their friend lying on the ground, writhing in pain. Tom was clutching his chest and gasping for air. There were deep scratch marks on his arms and legs, blood gushing from his chest. That's when they saw it. It was crouched down beside a nearby tree. It stood up and let out a loud scream. It towered over them. It was nearly 8 feet tall. It had the head of a buck and the body of a giant, emaciated man. Its withered skin was pulled tightly over its bones. Its bones were pushing out over its skin. Its complexion was the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into the sockets. It looked like a gaunt skeleton recently unearthed from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody. Unclean and suffering from the festering flesh, the monster gave off a strange and eerie odor of decay. They both yelled in fear. Mike fired off several rounds at the creature. This only seemed to piss it off. Jake unleashed his bear spray on the beast to no effect. Jake picked up a log on the fire and threw it at the beast. It hit it in the chest. Embers exploded around it like orange fireworks. The creature screamed in pain. It picked up Tom's body by skewering him with its long claws and ran into the darkness as Tom's cries faded away into the blackness of the night. Realizing they couldn't wait for the morning, they trudged their way back the way they came, struggling to find any kind of familiar landmark. As they continued their trek through the cold snow, Mike spoke up. "I know what that thing is." "Well, what is it?" Jake asked. "It's a Wendigo. My dad told me he saw one a long time ago." "Well, what the fuck is a Wendigo?" Jake inquired. "It's a cannibalistic creature from Native American folklore." "That sure as hell doesn't seem like folklore to me." Jake stopped walking. "Oh yeah? Well, that thing seems pretty fucking real to me." Just then, they heard a weak voice coming from the woods.
Guys, I'm over here. I need help.
Jake grabbed Mike's arm. Come on! Wait! Wendigos can mimic people's voices. That's not Tom. Confused, Jake asked, Are you sure? That sounded just like Tom. Mike held his finger to his lips. He crept around Jake in a tactical stance. With both hands on his pistol, he aimed it in the direction of the voice. After he took a few more steps, he heard it again.
Mike, Jake, I'm not gonna last much longer out here.
Feeling he had a good idea where the Wendigo was, Mike fired into the trees. A roar came from the bushes right beside Mike. Mike spun around and the Wendigo stood up and grabbed Mike by the throat, lifting him high off the ground. In a final act of defiance, Mike pointed the gun at the Wendigo's head and fired. His revolver was out of ammo. The Wendigo opened its huge mouth and with one bite ripped off Mike's head and began chewing it. Mike's body began violently twitching and shaking. The sickening, crunching sounds of Mike's skull nauseated Jake. I hope y'all didn't eat right before watching this. Nearly throwing up, Jake put his hand over his mouth and raced away from the Wendigo, back in the direction they had just come. Jake ran for as long as he could. He came to a clearing and stopped to catch his breath. His hands on his knees, he panted hard for several minutes. He finally looked up and noticed a small cabin about 100 yards away. He could see a light coming through the window and smoke coming from the chimney. He immediately dashed for the cabin. In no time, he made it to the cabin and started banging on the front door desperately. Hello? Hello? I need help. Let me in. He saw the curtain move. Then the door opened. An old man answered the door. Jake pushed past the old man and into the house. Taken aback, the old man asked,
"Could I help you, son?"
Out of breath, Jake crumbled onto the couch. "There's a Wendigo thing out there. It killed 3 of my friends, and now it's trying to kill me." The old man walked into the kitchen and returned with a cup of hot tea.
"Here, drink this. It'll calm you down."
Shaken profusely, Jake accepted the teacup with both hands and took a sip. Starting to relax a little, Jake looks around the cabin and notices a lot of Native American decorations. "You're Native American?" The old man responds.
"Yes, I'm a member of the Cree tribe. What makes you think it's a Wendigo?"
Jake tells the Native American what he saw, heard, and how the Wendigo killed his friends. The Cree Indian responded,
"Well, that does sound like a Wendigo. I can help you with killing this horrible creature."
The old man shuffled over to a bookshelf and pulled a box off of a shelf. At that moment, a loud scream was heard just outside the cabin. Then the sound of claws scratching the walls. Low thumps on the roof began. It was walking around on the roof of the cabin. The Cree Indian pulled a large, shiny, silver-looking knife out of the box. Surprisingly, there was no noise coming from the roof anymore. Both men looked around the cabin, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Oh, here we go. Loud bangs began at the front door. The door rattled wildly. The whole cabin began to shake with each hit. The hinges on the door started coming loose. The pounding on the door continued. With one final blow, the door flew off the hinges. The unbelievably tall Wendigo bent down and stomped through the threshold. It was much taller now than it was before, well over 10 feet. The old man ordered Jake,
"Grab the silver necklace from the box and put it on."
Jake fumbled through the box, found the necklace, and tried to clasp it, but was shaking too much to do it, so he wrapped it around his neck and just held it on. The Cree Indian began chanting in his native language. The Wendigo screamed and stared at the old man. It ambled up and took a swipe at the old man, but he dodged the strike. The old man knows how to bob and weave. Simultaneously, he sliced the Wendigo's arm with the dagger. The Wendigo screamed in pain and backed up. It took another shot at the old man. This time, it connected. Its long talons tore through the old fella's shirt. The man was bleeding, but not severely. Jake grabbed a glass vial from the box. It looked like it was filled with glitter. He threw it at the Wendigo. It hit its mark, right on the forehead of the beast, shattering on impact. A cloud of silvery dust formed around the Wendigo's head. The Wendigo's face began melting. The monster roared in pain and covered its eyes with its monstrous claws. Jumping at the opportunity, the old man lunged at the beast and buried the silver blade deep in the Wendigo's chest. Amidst repeated screams, the towering beast collapsed to its knees. It held out its arms to the side and let out one final scream before dropping to the floor. The old fella pulled the knife from the monster's chest and proceeded to carve out the Wendigo's heart. In short order, the Cree man pulled its cold, icy heart from its body.
"It's not over with yet,"
the old guy advised. He put the heart on a table and thrust the silver knife into the Wendigo's heart. The heart shattered, almost like glass. Across the room, the Wendigo moaned. The bits of heart were scattered around the room. They were steaming, not from heat, but from cold. Its heart was so cold, vapor was rolling off the pieces of heart on the floor. Jake looked at the old guy shocked.
"Gather up the pieces of heart and put them into the box,"
the old man instructed. As Jake put the final piece of the heart in the box and closed it, he thanked him for his help. He asked the Native American how to get out of the woods. Unexpectedly, the old man's face began to change. It was no longer smiling and friendly. It seemed devious. Horns began sprouting from its head, and his skin turned gray, and his bones began to poke at his skin from underneath. The old man looked at the door, and suddenly it flew back into place into the doorway. The old man gave an evil laugh, shook his head, and said,
"You're not leaving. I need to feed."
"Ah!"